about people like Samson and Deborah and their strengths, their weaknesses, as well as several others. So as we go on through the time of Judges, we then get to the book of Samuel. And when we first start looking at 1 Samuel and chapter 1, we see that Samuel, what it's fixing to introduce us to is that Samuel is the transition piece between Judges and the nation of Israel wanting a king. And anybody remember who that first king was? It was Saul. Okay? So when we go and we start looking at 1 Samuel chapter 8, which I'm going to read a little bit from in a few minutes just as background, 1 Samuel chapter 8 verses 1 through 5 deals with the idea of, Samuel, your sons are crooked. We don't want them as judges. We want a king. Now, what's some of the pitfalls of the king, of having a king? Well, Samuel explains that also in chapter 8. And then we then see that the people go ahead and they decide that they want a judge, and Saul is going to be appointed the judge. Now, when you have a king, you run into a lot of issues. One of the major issues when you want a king like other nations is that you're looking at the line of succession, because who is normally the king after the king dies? The king's oldest son. Okay? Or if you're more of an organized country like England is right now, there's a clear line of succession. But think back to the end of World War I, or towards the end of World War I, and what was going on in Russia at the time with Tsar Nicholas II. He basically abdicated his czarship, or whatever you want to call it. He was taken captive by the Bolsheviks. That was in the March 1917 time frame. And then he was killed a little over a year later by the Bolsheviks. Did they kill just him? They killed him, they killed his wife, they killed all his children. They killed the whole family at one time, in a room, in a house. And there's a nickname for the house. I can't remember what they called it, what it became known as. But even today, there are people who claim that if the Romanov family ever comes back, they're going to be either the Tsar or the Tsaress. This is the lady who claims that she's the next in line for being the leader of Russia if the Romanov family ever comes back. She's been claiming that for 30 years. Of course, it's disputed. But hey, that's what kingship is and queenship is. A lot of disputes. And we're going to see that happening with David and Saul and Mephibosheth, as well as several other issues that pop up. But we're going to see David's faith and what happens in David keeping his promise. So a little bit of the background. Without going into a lot of detail, I'm just going to flip through a lot of verses, and some of them I may not even cover. But if you start in 1 Samuel and start in chapter 8, it came to pass when Samuel was old that he made his sons judges over Israel. That's verse 1. Verse 3, but his sons did not walk in his ways, and they turned aside after dishonest gain, took bribes, and perverted justice. Sounds like a government. Okay? They took payoffs. His sons were crooked. And so the nation of Israel wanted nothing with all these sons running around being crooked. And they said to him, look, you are old, your sons don't walk in your ways. Give us a king to judge us like all other nations. Now Samuel was a Nazirite, had the attributes of a Nazirite. He was a prophet, he was a judge, he was a priest, he was a writer. That's how the Old Testament and New Testament describes him in various places. Well thought of. But he was that integration piece between judges and a king when they changed that. If we were to go ahead and flip on over to chapter 11 and verse 13, you will see in chapter 11 and verse 13 specifically, and actually it's verse 15. 15. Yeah, if I read it right. So all the people went to Gilgad and they made Saul king. So that's where the little line in the sand is, where now they've done away with judges. The nation's going to have a king. Now, as we go over to chapter 14 and we look at 49 and 50, here's where we start seeing the idea that it lets us know that Saul had a family. He has 3 sons, he has 2 daughters, and he has a wife. And that's what chapter 14, verses 49 through 50 talks about. Jonathan is mentioned first. That means he's the oldest. But what does that also mean about Jonathan, with Saul being king? Jonathan's next in line for kingship. That's what other nations do. Unless he's, of course, overthrown, killed, and probably a lot of members of his family killed. That's what traditional kingship is in this time of the world. And even today, in many areas of the world, it's like that. So we get this idea, and this is where we first get introduced to Jonathan and his family. But Saul starts having some issues. When we look at chapter 16, we start, and we've already seen through some of the previous chapters of Saul's military campaigns, the sins of Saul. We're not going to read those details. And God is now going to replace Saul with David. So that's God's decision for his people and to protect his people at this time as they transition. God is taking means to protect the people from their own ways, is what he's trying to do. Okay? And just like we talked about a few weeks ago with Balaam, where, God had to protect Balaam from his own ways. And God protects us from our own ways at times. We just don't recognize it. So when you look at, and you see this, look at chapter 16, the end of verses 1. It says, "For I have provided myself a king among his sons," meaning the son of Jesse. And so it's going to be David. And in verse 13 and 14 of chapter 16 is where we see the Spirit of God changes. In verse 13, it says, "The Spirit of the Lord came upon David from that day forward." In verse 14, it says, "The Spirit of the Lord departed from Saul, and a distressing spirit from the Lord troubled him." So that's where we see in the background of how David now transitions. When we look at in chapter 17, then we get to the story of David and Goliath. As we continue on and we get to the end of verse 17, we now see where Saul confronts David and basically says, "Who are you?" And in verse 58 it says, "And Saul said to him, Whose son are you, young man?" And David answered, "I'm the son of your servant Jesse." So David takes a humble approach when he's introduced or meets Saul. And then in chapter 18 is where it talks about this bond that Jonathan, who's next in line for king, now has with David. Okay? Now, when he had finished speaking to Saul, the soul of Jonathan was knit to the soul of David, and Jonathan loved him as his own soul. Then look at verse 3. "Then Jonathan and David made a covenant because he loved him as his own soul. And Jonathan took off the robe that was on him and gave it to David with his armor, even to his sword, and with his bow, his bow and his belt." And then what follows this is Saul gets jealous. And this talks about Saul's jealousy as you continue on. Because not only has the people recognized, not only has God recognized David, now will become the king, but the people are recognizing David with some examples that are here in chapter 18. And on top of that, Saul's oldest son, who legitimately, in Saul's mind, is the next in line for king, now has this loving bondship with David. So Saul he doesn't understand. And he becomes insanely jealous, so to speak. And he begins these attempts to then kill David. And that's what we'll see beginning in chapter 19. And there's multiple attempts that are mentioned that we won't go into those details. If we were to look in chapter 26, which I don't have up here, David actually saves Saul's life at one point. And then when we go over to chapter 31 is where we see the end of the book of 1 Samuel. And in the end of 1 Samuel, in chapter 31, is to look at verses 2 and 4. Here's where the Philistines are fighting against Israel. In verse 2, then the Philistines followed hard after Saul and his sons, and they killed Jonathan. And then in verse 4, we see where Saul, knowing that he's going to be killed, kills himself. So on the same day, Jonathan and Saul are killed while battling the Philistines, just in different ways. Now, what's not telling you here is that Saul, through a concubine, had other sons. In other words, Jonathan had half-brothers. And one of those half-brothers was Mephibosheth. And that's where we're going to get into now, looking at what is the approach that David is talking about with 2 Samuel chapter 9. Because now we go through a lot of detail in terms of David and the nation of Israel. But, in fact, if you look at chapter 7, and this is just an oh, by the way, chapter 7 in 2 Samuel is where God tells David, you will not be building my house, and the reasons for it. Okay? But he does say in verses 12 and 13, when your days are fulfilled and you rest with your fathers, I will set up your seed after you, who will come from your body, and I will establish his kingdom. He shall build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. So this is the prophecy of Christ coming. Okay? Through the seed of David, through the seed of Jesse. And then when we get over to the end of chapter 8 is where we start seeing David's power, his military power. In verse 13 in chapter 8 it says, and David made himself a name when he returned from killing 18,000 Syrians in the Valley of Salt. So his military strength had grown tremendously. And now we get into David starts remembering Jonathan. And in chapter 9 of 2 Samuel, he says, now David said, is there still anyone who is left of the house of Saul that I may show him kindness for Jonathan's sake? David being king, what would a normal king do if he's looking for any descendants of the previous king? Kill them. I've got to make sure all the competition is eliminated. That's what's normal. If you're like other nations, I want to go find who it is and kill them. I don't want this person creeping up in the middle of the night hiring people to kill me. So that's kind of, when it starts out, that makes it sound like the mindset, but The writer of this says, show him kindness for Jonathan's sake. It's not kill him because Saul tried to kill me, and he's a descendant of Saul. Because that's where you start getting into the mindset here. In verse 2, we see that there was a servant of the house of Saul whose name was Ziba. Okay? They called him to David. And look at verse 3. This is where we start understanding more about David's approach and his basis for it. He says, then the king said, is there not still someone of the house of Saul to whom I may show the kindness of God? He doesn't care who this person is. He's just looking for someone to show the kindness of God as a tribute to his covenant of faithfulness to Jonathan. So he said to the king, there's still a son of Jonathan who is lame in his feet. So here is someone who is basically, can't walk. Okay? Is the vernacular that I would use. So the king said to him, where is he? And he tells him where he is. Verse 5, then King David sent and brought him. Now, if you are lame and you are the grandson of the previous king, and lo and behold, somebody shows up that says, the king wants to see you, what is your first thought? I'm dead. Exactly. He found me. Who told on me? All these things probably run in your mind, even to the point of, okay, I will go, but I have got to really watch my, the old Southern term is P's and Q's. Got to be careful. I don't know what's going to happen here. Either I kill myself now or I get killed later. So let's just see what happens. So now, when Mephibosheth, this is where we get introduced to him, the son of Jonathan, the son of Saul, had come to David. He fell on his face and prostrated himself, and David said, Mephibosheth. And he answered, here is your servant. So he's being as humble as he can be. What do you think his emotions are right now, Mephibosheth? He's in fear. He is lame. He's been called into the carpet, and he is fearful of his life. And it even talks about it here when David said, do not fear. So the guy was obviously showing fear. For I will surely show you kindness for Jonathan, your father's sake. And look what he's going to do. Will restore to you all the land of Saul, your grandfather, and you shall eat bread at my table continually. Everything that had belonged to Saul. Now, you got to keep in mind, Saul was not leader or king over all of Israel. He had part of it. David had part of it. And now David becomes king over all of it. And so now David is saying, to honor Jonathan in the covenant that we had, I'm giving you back this part right here that your grandfather originally had. Which probably really shocked this individual. Okay? So he said, here's what you'll do. And not only that, you're welcome in my house anytime to eat at my table. Then he bowed himself and said, what is your servant that you should look upon such a dead dog as I? I looked at, maybe 30 biblical translations, and every one of them uses the phrase dead dog. What do you think he's trying to get across? What does he think of himself? Other than low self-esteem. He puts an extreme self-humiliation on himself when he gets this low. Okay? You look at his misfortune. He looks at his deformity. He looks at the disparity of rank. Here I am, a person who can barely walk if he even walks at all. I'm poor. You took everything from You basically took everything my grandfather used to have. So there's such a wide disparity here in physical and, also possession-wise. And so he saw himself, probably also with his deformity, he probably saw himself as being despised by people in his life. So we see that, and I think that's what it means when he refers to himself as a dead dog. It's everything he's been through. Having his father and his grandfather die on the same day, in the same area, in the same battle, essentially. Okay, so, and the king called to Ziba, Saul's servant, and said to him, I have given to your master's son all that belonged to Saul and all his house. In other words, help him manage it. This is what I have given, which basically now, you become part owner, not part owner, but you become part responsible for it because you've got to help him. You therefore and your sons and your servants shall work the land for him, and you shall bring in the harvest that your master's son may have food to eat. Which makes you think that they were very poor. Another disparity between them. And he goes on to say that, your master's welcome at my table anytime. So they go their way. In verse 12, we see Mephibosheth had a young son, and all who dwelt in the house of Ziba were servants of Mephibosheth. So they dwelt in Jerusalem, and he ate continually at the king's table, and he was lame in both of his feet. Okay? Now, that's the first 13 verses. And I don't know why I have 1 through 15 up there. I'll correct that before I use this again. But what does that tell you about the unexpected blessing that David put on this person? David did not have to do that, but he kept the promise. And in a way, it gets worse. Right when you think things are better, they actually get a little worse between these two. These two had kind of a complicated relationship. Because if you go over and you look at chapter 16 and verse 2, when David is basically kind of on the run, hiding out because he's got so many enemies, in 16 and verse 2, or 16 and verse 3, David runs into the servant, Ziba, Z-I-B-A. And he says, hey, where's your master's son? Anyway, he said, today the house of Israel will restore the kingdom of my father to me. In other words, the implication is Mephibosheth is thinking, or at least his entourage is thinking, that he's now going to become king in place of David. This kind of shocks David. Well, it wakes him up. I'll put it like that. But let's see what David does. Because the second unexpected blessing is that David saves his life, as he had done Saul way back in chapter 26 of 1 Samuel. In chapter 21, as we start wrapping this up, chapter 21, beginning in verse 1, gives us the background of this event that's fixing to happen. It says, now there was a famine in the days of David for 3 years. And David inquired of the Lord, and the Lord answered, it is because of Saul and the bloodthirsty house, because he killed the Gibeonites. Okay, so that's the reason for the famine that God gives David. So in verse 2, so the king called the Gibeonites and spoke to them. Now the Gibeonites were not of the children of Israel, but of the remnant of the Amorites. The children of Israel had sworn protection to them, but Saul had sought to kill them in his zeal for the children of Israel and Judah. Therefore David said to the Gibeonites, "What shall I do for you? And with what shall I make atonement that you may bless the inheritance of the Lord?" In other words, what would the Gibeonites that Israel had sworn to protect require as an atonement? And guess what they wanted? They wanted 7 members of Saul's family so they could hang them. Retribution. Give us 7 members of his family. So David has to make a decision. Where can I find 7 members of Saul's family? He definitely knows of one. And this is where we get introduced to the other Mephibosheth. Because there was actually 2. And if you read through this too fast, you won't pick up that there's actually 2 of them that's being talked about. Okay, then they answered the king, "As for the man who consumed us and plotted against us that we shall be destroyed from remaining in any of the territories of Israel, let 7 men of his descendants be delivered to us that we can hang them." Okay? And David said, "I'll give you them." Okay? But the king spared Mephibosheth, the son of Jonathan, the son of Saul, because of the Lord's oath that was between them, between David and Jonathan. So another unexpected blessing that David, again, going back to his covenant, to keep that covenant faithful. So the king spared him, okay? In verse 8, so the king took, and we see there's a Amani, and then there's another Mephibosheth. That other Mephibosheth is Jonathan's half-brother. It is a son that Saul had through a concubine. And that's who this other person was. So he took the 2 men that were available through the concubine of Saul and gave them, so that's 2 of them. He still needed 5 more. And what he did then is he took the 5 sons of one of the daughters of Saul. They probably thought they had it made until that time. So there's the 7 that were killed. And he delivered them into the hands of the Gibeonites, and they hanged them on the hill before the Lord. So that was the retribution. So another example of an unexpected blessing. Anybody have any thoughts of that or any insight? I got just a few quick lessons learned that I either picked up on out of other documents or myself.
Note David is honoring an agreement that was made under a trickery. You remember that?
Oh yeah.
The giving up. When
Yeah.
they dressed up like they were poor and they didn't, and Joshua let them go. Made an agreement with them.
Yep. Even that was trickery.
Yeah, still honoring a couple 103 years later.
Yeah. Yep. The Gibeonites had pulled a fast one, and now here they were pulling another one. Well, let's look at just a few lessons, see what we can learn from this. Do we recognize unexpected blessings from God? It's a good thing to just stop and think about sometime. Things that happen that benefit us, to take a step back and say, okay, what really happened here? And why? And now how can I promote God with it? The other one is, how do we demonstrate to others the kindness of God? That's how how David did, and how it's described in 2 Samuel chapter 9 and verse 3. why he was doing this. It wasn't just for Jonathan, but it was also to display the kindness of God. And then God uses people to bless others who feel forgotten. And then the last two is, no matter how weak or broken we may feel, or our flaws or our shortcomings, there's always a place for us at God's table. And then the last one is, if someone wrongs us, just like Mephibosheth, when he said, when the servant says, hey, we're planning on him being king now. David could have very easily said, okay, here's your 7, and included Jonathan's son in it, who had wronged him. But he didn't. He kept, again, that original covenant blessing. Any last words on that before we just have a short invitation? Okay, let's take just a couple of moments just to think back on the lesson that we've got. And we do offer this, an opportunity every time we come together to be able to just stop and reflect and see that, if we're not a Christian, should we become one? Or even if we are a Christian but we don't feel like we've been meeting what we should be, the time to reflect to see if we have any needs or any support. And also, gives you an opportunity for whatever you want to address. So we're going to offer that now. Be thinking about the lesson, the unexpected blessings that we receive from God. How do we display, the blessings that we can receive from God? And as we do so, we'll have an invitation song, and then after that we'll have a closing prayer. So, Marlon, for the invitation song.
More love to thee, O Christ, more love to thee. Hear thou the prayer I make on bended knee. This is my earnest plea.
it is good seeing everyone here today and online. Let's have a short prayer, and then we'll have our closing song. Let us pray. Our most gracious Heavenly Father, we thank you for today, for the many blessings you've given us. We thank you for your word so that we can study and learn another portion of it, that we can learn about the unexpected blessings that we can receive, that we need to understand that they do come from you. We thank you for being here tonight, and we thank you for the nation we live in. And as we continue with our closing song, may we remain safe for the remainder of the week until we return. Through Jesus Christ we pray. Amen.
Lord, make me a servant. Lord, make me like you. For you are a servant. Make me one too. Lord, make me a servant. Do what you must do.